The stagecoach groaned to a halt, its leather straps sighing like a tired old man settling into his favorite chair. For a long moment, the only sound was the jangling of the harnesses as the 4 exhausted horses dropped their heads, their breath clouding in the cooling air. Then, the driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, swung the door open with a weary grunt. She descended, not with the light, hurried step of a woman eager to meet her destination, but with a slow, deliberate placement of one worn boot after the other onto the dusty ground. The stiffness in her limbs was from more than just the long, rattling journey. It was a deep-set ache that had settled in her bones. She stood tall, her back a straight, unyielding line against the vast, indifferent sky. Her simple, dark dress was coated in the fine, pale dust of the trail, a second skin that muted its color and clung to every seam. She held a single, scuffed leather satchel in one hand. It was all she had. No one was there to greet her. The stagecoach was the last of the day, and its arrival stirred little interest in the town of Dust Creek. A few men loitering on the porch of the saloon turned their heads, their gazes lingering for a moment before dismissing her. The coach driver tossed her satchel into the dirt beside her without a word, climbed back onto his perch, and with a sharp crack of his whip, urged the tired horses into a lumbering turn. The coach rattled away, leaving her alone in a cloud of its own making. Her eyes were dry. They had been dry for days, as if the wellspring of tears inside her had finally been exhausted, leaving behind only an arid, hollow landscape. But her heart was not. Her heart was a raw, tender bruise, a leaden weight in her chest that made each breath feel like a conscious effort. As the dust settled, she took her first real look at Dust Creek. It was less a town and more a stubborn suggestion of one. A handful of weathered timber buildings clinging to the edges of a wide, rutted dirt road. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoed faintly, and a livery stable made up most of its spine. A few smaller, nameless structures huddled together as if for warmth against the ceaseless wind that swept down from the high plains. The place smelled of horse manure, pine smoke, and something else, a dry, mineral scent of earth that had forgotten the taste of rain. She bent, her back remaining straight as a ramrod, and picked up her bag. As she began to walk, she felt the eyes. They came from the shadows of doorways, from behind the grime-streaked glass of windows, from the men on the saloon porch. Conversations that had been a low murmur a moment before now fell silent, the quiet pressing in on her. The gazes were not openly hostile, but they were heavy with a hard, assessing curiosity. They stripped her down, catalogued the decent but worn fabric of her dress, the tight set of her jaw, the profound solitude that clung to her like a shroud. To them, she was an anomaly, a lone woman arriving at dusk with no purpose they could name. She was a question, and in a town like Dust Creek, unanswered questions were often a prelude to trouble. She could feel their unspoken thoughts as keenly as the wind on her cheeks. The women, glimpsed for a moment as they drew a curtain closed, their eyes as hard and smooth as river stones. The men, their appraisal more overt, a mixture of crude interest and suspicion. They looked at her as if she had brought the cold wind with her, a harbinger of a winter they weren't prepared for. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the far end of the street, refusing to meet any of their eyes. She had learned long ago that meeting a stare was an invitation, and she had no invitations left to give. Her past was a ghost that walked beside her, and in the harsh light of their scrutiny, she felt as if they could all see it, as if the shame of a night bartered away by another's hand was a brand seared upon her skin. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. The dusk was a lonely time, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath between the labor of the day and the uncertainty of the night. Long, distorted shadows stretched from the buildings, making the small town seem labyrinthine and strange. She needed a place to sleep, a door to close and lock against the world. She passed the saloon, the sound of rough laughter and a tinny piano spilling out into the street. She didn't so much as glance toward the swinging doors. She continued on, her boots making soft, rhythmic thuds in the deep dust. The general store was already dark, its owner likely home for supper. Further down, she saw a small, hand-painted sign swaying gently in the breeze. It was weathered, the white paint flaking, but the letters were still clear * Willow House, rooms and board. The building was modest, a 2-story timber structure that looked a little cleaner, a little more cared for than its neighbors. Its porch was scrubbed, and a pot of withered but determined geraniums sat on the railing. It seemed a small island of quiet dignity in the rough-hewn town. Taking a steadying breath, she mounted the 3 wooden steps and pushed the door open. A small bell chimed softly, announcing her arrival. The air inside was warm and smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and roasting meat. It was a scent of domestic peace, so alien to her that it made the ache in her chest sharpen. A woman stood behind a small wooden counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back into a tight, practical bun. Her face was lined with the quiet patience of someone who had seen much and said little, and her hands, though chapped and work-worn, moved with a steady, unhurried grace. She looked up as Clara entered. Her eyes were a pale, clear blue, and they held none of the invasive curiosity of the townspeople. They simply saw. They saw a tall woman, standing straight and still just inside the door, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her satchel. They saw the dust of the trail and the deeper, more indelible dust of exhaustion that lay upon her features. "Evening," the woman said. Her voice was low and calm. Clara had to clear her throat before she could speak. Her own voice sounded foreign to her, a dry rasp. "I'm looking for a room, just for the night." The woman nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Got 1 room left, top of the stairs, to the right. It's small, but the bed is clean." She named a price, a fair one. And Clara reached into the small reticule tied at her waist, her fingers fumbling for the few coins she possessed. The woman's name was Agnes Wilkes, though Clara would not learn that until later. For now, she was simply a steady presence in a world that had become unstable ground. As Clara placed the coins on the counter, Agnes didn't look at the money. She looked at the younger woman's face, and for the first time, Clara felt seen without feeling judged. It was a startling sensation, like a warm hand on a frozen limb. "Supper's on in half an hour, if you've a mind for it," Agnes said, her tone gentle. "Beef stew." Clara simply nodded, unable to form another word. She picked up her satchel, the worn leather a familiar and comfortless weight. She turned and walked toward the narrow staircase in the corner, her boots echoing on the clean-swept wooden floorboards. She did not look back, but she could feel Agnes Wilkes's quiet, unobtrusive gaze on her until she reached the first step and began to climb into the beckoning shadows of the upper floor. The room was at the top of a narrow, creaking staircase. When Clara pushed the door open, a wave of cold air washed over her, smelling of old pine and the lingering chill of a long, unoccupied space. It was just as Agnes had said, small. A simple iron-frame bed was pushed against one wall, a lumpy mattress beneath a single, thick wool blanket folded neatly at its foot. Beside it stood a small, 3-legged stool with a wash basin and a pitcher of water. A single window, its glass wavy and imperfect, looked out onto the dark, empty main street of Dust Creek. There was nothing else. No rug on the floor, no picture on the wall, no mirror to reflect her own tired face back at her. It was a room stripped down to its barest essentials, a place to be alone, a place to be sheltered from the wind. For a long moment, Clara simply stood in the doorway, her hand still on the cool brass knob. The stark emptiness of the room should have felt lonely, another reflection of the hollow space inside her. Instead, a strange sense of relief trickled through her. There were no pretenses here, no frilly curtains to hide behind, no fancy furniture to make her feel out of place. It was honest, The room did not pretend to be more than it was, and in its stark simplicity, it asked nothing of her. She could be as empty and as quiet as the space around her, and it would not matter. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The sound seemed loud in the stillness. She set her satchel down by the foot of the bed and walked to the window. Below, a single lantern cast a weak, golden pool of light on the porch of the saloon across the way. The town was utterly quiet now, swallowed by the immense, star-dusted darkness of the prairie. It was a crushing, beautiful emptiness. She felt like the last person on earth. Her stomach rumbled, a sharp, insistent ache that broke through her stupor. Agnes had said supper was on. The thought of going back downstairs, of facing even that one quiet woman again, felt like a monumental effort. It would be easier to stay here, to fill the wash basin and drink the cold water and climb into bed. It would be safer. But the smell of the beef stew still lingered in her memory, a promise of warmth and substance that her body craved with a primal urgency. She had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. Survival was a stubborn, unglamorous thing. It was a growling stomach and aching feet, and right now, survival demanded she go back downstairs. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door. The common room was warmer than before. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its light dancing on the simple wooden tables. 2 men sat at one of them, hunched over their bowls, eating with the focused silence of the truly hungry. They were prospectors or trappers, she guessed, their faces weathered and bearded, their clothes coarse and practical. They glanced up when she entered, their eyes lingering for a beat before they returned to their food, their curiosity apparently sated or deemed not worth the effort. Agnes stood by the hearth, stirring something in a large pot that hung from a black iron hook. She looked over her shoulder and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward an empty table in the corner. "Help yourself," she said, her voice the same low, calm timbre as before. "Bread's on the sideboard." Clara moved to the table, her body feeling stiff and awkward. She sat with her back to the corner, a habit she'd developed without realizing it, a need to see the whole room, to have no one behind her. Agnes brought over a steaming bowl of stew and set it down in front of her. It was thick with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots, the gravy a rich, dark brown. The smell was so powerfully comforting that it almost brought tears to her dry eyes. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. Agnes didn't reply immediately. She went to the sideboard, which held a large, round loaf of dark bread and a crock of butter, and cut a thick slice. She brought it to the table and placed it on a small plate beside the stew. Only then did she speak, and her voice was so low it was meant only for Clara. "You don't have to tell a soul anything, girl," she said, her clear blue eyes looking not at Clara's face, but at her hands, which were clenched into tight fists on her lap. "Not me, not anyone in this town. Some stories aren't for telling, they're for outliving." The words hung in the air between them, more substantial than the steam rising from the bowl. Clara froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She had been preparing her own story, a simple, plausible lie about being a widow heading west to meet family she didn't have. It was a flimsy shield, but it was all she'd been able to construct. She had expected questions polite, perhaps, but probing. Asterisk. Where are you from? Where are you headed? Who are your people? Asterisk. She had expected to have to earn her small measure of peace with a performance. But Agnes was asking for nothing. She was offering sanctuary, freely and without condition. The kindness was so unexpected, so profound. It felt like a physical blow. It struck down all her defenses, leaving her exposed and trembling. She felt a sudden, sharp urge to weep, a violent storm of grief and gratitude that threatened to break through the dam she had so carefully built inside herself. She fought it down, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. She would not cry, not here, not in front of anyone. She could only nod, a single, jerky movement of her head. Agnes seemed to understand. She placed a gentle, fleeting hand on Clara's shoulder. The touch was brief, no more than a feather's weight. But it was the first kind human touch Clara had felt in what felt like a lifetime. It was not a touch that asked for anything or took anything. It was a touch that simply gave. And then, as quickly as she had come, Agnes moved away, returning to her duties by the fire, leaving Clara alone with her stew and the reverberating echo of her words. There for outliving. Clara picked up her fork and began to eat. The stew was hot, and she ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself to chew each mouthful, to focus on the simple grounding act of nourishing her body. The food was a tether to the present moment, keeping her from drifting away on the tide of her own memories. The two men finished their meal, scraped their chairs back, and left with quiet nods to Agnes. Soon. Clara was the only one left in the common room. When she had finished every last drop, she took her bowl and plate to the counter where Agnes was now washing dishes in a basin of hot, soapy water. "It was very good," Clara said, her voice a little stronger now. "Thank you." "You were welcome to it," Agnes replied, not turning around. "The room is yours until morning. Don't feel you have to be out at the crack of dawn. Rest is a rare commodity." Clara stood there for a moment longer, wanting to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. There were no words for what she felt, so she turned and walked back up the stairs. When she entered the room again, it felt different. The cold was still there, but it no longer felt hostile. It was just a quiet, empty space that was hers for the night. She went to the basin and poured some of the cool water, splashing it on her face. She looked at her reflection in the water's surface, a distorted, wavering image of a stranger with haunted eyes. She looked away. She was bone-weary, an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and sinew. It was a weariness of the soul. All she wanted was to lie down. She looked at the bed, then down at her own dusty dress and her heavy, worn boots. The thought of undressing, of making herself vulnerable even to the empty room, was too much to bear. Her clothes were an armor. Her boots were a promise that she could run if she needed to. So she didn't take them off. She pulled back the thick, heavy wool blanket. It was surprisingly clean and smelled faintly of lavender, just like the air downstairs, and slid onto the mattress. She lay on her back, her arms stiff at her sides, her boots hanging over the edge of the iron frame. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, a heavy, comforting weight. She lay there, staring up into the darkness, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her. A floorboard creaked downstairs. The wind whispered around the eaves. For the first time in a long time, the sounds were just sounds. They were not threats. They were not footsteps outside her door. Agnes Wilkes' words had built a wall around this small room, a wall of non-judgment, a wall that kept the prying, demanding world at bay. She expected to lie awake for hours, her mind replaying the same ugly scenes it always did in the dark. But the warmth of the stew settled in her belly, the weight of the blanket calmed her trembling limbs, and the profound, unconditional quiet of Willow House seeped into her bones. Her breathing deepened, her clenched fists slowly uncurled. In a cold room in a strange town, sheltered by the quiet strength of a woman who asked for nothing, Clara slept, and for one night, it was a sleep without dreams. It was a night of peace. Clara awoke not to a sound, but to a change in the quality of the silence. The deep, insulating quiet of the dead of night had thinned, replaced by the faint, almost imperceptible hum of a world stirring. She lay still for a long moment, her eyes closed, listening. There was the distant crow of a rooster, a lonely, defiant sound against the vast emptiness of the prairie. Then, a new sound, sharp and rhythmic, cut through the morning air the first blow of a hammer on an anvil from the blacksmith's forge. It was a sound of purpose, of work to be done. It was a sound that reminded her she had none. She sat up, the thick wool blanket pooling in her lap. The room was even colder than it had been the night before, a damp, biting chill that seemed to seep through the timber walls. Her breath plumed in front of her face in a small, white cloud. She felt a stiffness in her joints, a deep-seated ache from sleeping in her clothes, in her boots. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, the iron frame groaning in protest. Her feet, still encased in worn leather, felt clumsy and foreign on the cold floorboards. For a moment, the fragile peace of the previous night felt like a distant dream. Reality returned with the cold light of day, a thin, gray light that filtered through the single window, offering little warmth and no comfort. She was in a town called Dust Creek. She had a few coins left, enough for another night's stay, perhaps one more meager meal. And then what? The question loomed, as vast and empty as the sky outside her window. She pushed herself to her feet and went to the wash basin. The water in the pitcher was icy cold, and she gasped as she splashed it on her face, the shock of it chasing away the last vestiges of sleep. It was a harsh but necessary baptism into the new day. She used her fingers to comb through her tangled hair, tucking the stray strands back into the tight, severe bun at the nape of her neck. She smoothed the wrinkles from her dusty dress as best she could. A futile gesture that did little to change her appearance, but was a necessary ritual, a small act of defiance against the disarray of her life. She was not a vagrant. She was a woman in search of work. She made her way downstairs, her steps soft on the creaking wood. The common room was empty, the fire in the hearth now just a bed of glowing, orange embers. A pot of coffee sat on a trivet near the warmth, and the rich, bitter smell filled the air. Agnes Wilkes was nowhere to be seen. Clara felt a pang of disappointment. The quiet strength of the older woman had been a strange and unexpected anchor. On the counter sat a tin cup and a note written in a neat, spidery script asterisk. Help yourself. Leave a penny in the jar. Clara found a penny in her reticule and dropped it into the small ceramic jar with a soft clink. She poured a cup of the black coffee. It was strong and hot, and as she drank it, standing alone in the quiet room, she felt a small measure of strength return to her limbs. It was the strength of necessity, the fuel for the task ahead. She had to find work, any work. She would sweep floors, scrub laundry, peel potatoes, mend clothes, anything that would earn her a meal and a roof over her head for another day. She rinsed her cup, left it by the wash basin, and pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the morning. The air was sharp and clean, and it scoured her lungs. Dust Creek looked different in the daylight. The harsh morning sun exposed its flaws, the peeling paint, the warped timbers, the deep, permanent ruts in the road. It was a town built for function, not for beauty, a place where survival was the primary architecture. The sounds of the blacksmith's hammer were louder now, a steady, driving rhythm that was the town's heartbeat. A few people were about, a woman shaking a rug from an upstairs window, a man loading sacks of flour onto a wagon in front of the general store. They glanced at her, their expressions shuttered and uninviting, before turning back to their tasks. She was an outsider, a piece that didn't fit, and they had no time for puzzles. She walked the short length of the street, her eyes scanning for any sign, any possibility. The saloon was being swept out, a cloud of stale-smelling dust and sawdust billowing from its swinging doors. She would not ask for work there. The general store seemed her most likely prospect, but the man out front had a hard, pinched face, and he didn't even acknowledge her as she passed. A deep sense of hopelessness began to settle in her chest. As cold and heavy as a stone, this town, like so many others, had already judged her. It had looked at her lone figure, her single satchel, and the shadows in her eyes, and it had closed its doors. She had almost reached the end of the street, where the town frayed into the open prairie, when she turned back, determined to try the general store despite the owner's severe expression. As she did, her gaze fell upon the blacksmith's forge. The wide doors were thrown open, and inside, in the fiery glow of the furnace, a man was working, his arm rising and falling with the hammer. But it wasn't the smith who caught her attention. It was another man, standing just outside, holding the reins of a sturdy-looking sorrel horse. He was leaning against a hitching post, his boots already off the ground and crossed at the ankles, a posture of relaxed patience. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful, with the kind of broad shoulders that came from hard, physical labor. He wore canvas trousers tucked into scuffed boots, and a simple flannel shirt beneath a worn leather vest. A low-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, obscuring his features. He was completely still, watching the blacksmith work, seemingly oblivious to the life of the town around him. There was a quiet competence in his stillness, a sense of being entirely at home in his own skin. Clara hesitated. She had no business with the blacksmith, no reason to approach. But as she stood there, her courage failing her, the man pushed himself off the post and turned his head. His gaze swept over the street and, for a moment, it met hers. She flinched, expecting the familiar, invasive appraisal, the look that stripped her bare and found her wanting. But it wasn't there, his eyes a clear, steady gray. She saw in that brief instant didn't linger on her face or her figure. They registered her presence, noted her, and then moved on, as if she were no more or less interesting than the wagon or the building behind her. It was a look that was utterly devoid of judgment. He took a step in her direction, and her first instinct was to turn and walk away, to retreat to the cold safety of her room, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. He stopped a few paces from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but far enough to respect her space. He took off his hat, a gesture of politeness that seemed almost out of place in the rough town, and ran a hand through his dark, sweat-dampened hair. Now she could see his face clearly. It was a young face, probably not yet 30, but it was weathered by sun and wind, with fine lines etched around his eyes. It was a serious face, but not an unkind one. "Mornin', ma'am," he said. His voice was a low baritone, a calm rumble that didn't startle her. It was a voice that was used to speaking to nervous horses. Clara could only manage a slight, stiff nod in return. He didn't seem to mind her silence. His gaze drifted to a point just over her shoulder, as if he were looking at the distant hills. "The outfit I ride for is short a cook," he said, his tone direct and matter-of-fact. "Our last one had a disagreement with a bottle of whiskey and a rattlesnake. The snake won." He paused, and the corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. Then his expression became serious again. He looked down at her hands, which she had unconsciously clasped in front of her, a knot of white-knuckled tension. "The work is hard. The days are long. The men are hungry and not always pleasant. But the pay is fair, and you get your own wagon." He looked up again, his gray eyes meeting hers for a second before shifting away. "If you can boil an egg without it breaking, you've got the job." The offer was so simple, so unexpected, it took her breath away. There was no preamble, no suspicious questioning. He didn't ask her name, he didn't ask where she came from, who her people were, or why a woman was traveling alone. He didn't ask for a reference. He asked only for a single, basic skill. It was the most respectful proposition she had received in her entire life. He was offering her a chance not based on her past, but on a simple, tangible ability. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. A war was being fought inside her. Her entire life had taught her to be suspicious of men who offered things, to look for the hidden price, the inevitable debt. But this man, this stranger, seemed different. There was no slyness in his eyes, no hidden meaning in his words. His gaze was direct but not challenging. It was a look that saw her as a potential worker, a solution to a practical problem, and nothing more. It was a look that did not try to see into her, that did not touch the bruised and broken places she kept hidden from the world. He stood there patiently, waiting for her answer, his hat held in his hand. He did not press her. He did not fidget. He simply waited, giving her the space and the silence to make her own decision. He was giving her a choice. Finally, she found her voice. It was little more than a croak. "I can—" "You can what?" he asked, his voice still calm. "I can boil an egg," she said, a little louder this time. He gave a slow, single nod. "All right, then." He put his hat back on his head. "I'm Luke Carver. We're moving a herd north. We pull out in an hour. Meet me back here. Bring your things." And with that, he turned, swung himself up into his saddle with an easy, fluid motion, and tipped his hat to her one last time. He didn't wait for another reply. He didn't say another word. He just nudged his horse into a walk and rode away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the dusty street, the blacksmith's hammer still ringing in the cold morning air. Clara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had a job. It was a hard job, a dangerous one perhaps, heading out into the wilderness with a group of strange men. But it was a job. It was a future, even if it was only for a day, a week. It was a step away from the past. She turned and walked back toward Willow House, her steps quicker now, more purposeful. No one had asked her name. No one had mentioned the night before, or any of the nights that had come before that. For the first time in a very long time, she was not a woman with a history. She was just a cook who knew how to boil an egg, and for now, that was enough. An hour was not much time. Clara returned to Willow House with a sense of unreality, as if she were moving through someone else's dream. She found Agnes Wilkes in the kitchen, kneading a great mound of dough on a floured wooden board. The older woman looked up as she entered, her pale blue eyes taking in Clara's hurried posture and the new, sharp glint of purpose in her expression. Clara explained in a few clipped sentences. A job, a cattle drive north, leaving immediately. She did not mention Luke Carver by name. He was still just a stranger, a voice, an offer. She expected a warning, perhaps a lecture on the foolishness of a woman heading into the wilderness with a crew of cowboys. Instead, Agnes simply wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. "A trail cook's work is honest," she said, her tone level. "And it's a long way from wherever you came from." It was a statement of fact, not a question, and it was imbued with a deep, quiet understanding. Without another word, Agnes moved about her kitchen. She took a half loaf of the bread from the night before and wrapped it in a clean cloth. She added a small wheel of hard cheese and a dried apple from a string hanging above the stove. She packed it all into a small canvas sack and pressed it into Clara's hands. "The trail will provide for your meals," Agnes said. "But a person sometimes needs a bite that isn't cooked over an open fire." Tears pricked at the back of Clara's dry eyes. She had paid for her room and her meal. She was owed nothing. This simple, practical gift was another act of unearned kindness, and it undid her more than any cruelty could have. "I can't," she began, but Agnes cut her off. "Nonsense. Go on, now. The man is waiting." Their farewell was as unspoken as their meeting. A long look passed between them, a moment of silent acknowledgement from one woman who had survived her life to another who was still in the midst of surviving hers. Then Clara turned and walked out the door for the last time. Luke Carver was waiting, just as he said he would be. Her future was a sturdy, high-sided chuck wagon, its canvas cover bleached pale by the sun, hitched to a pair of patient, powerful-looking mules. Luke stood beside it, checking a strap on the harness. He looked up as she approached, his gaze as steady and unreadable as before. "This'll be your world," he said, gesturing to the wagon with a nod of his head. "Everything a cook needs is in there. Flour, beans, coffee, bacon, skillets, and a sourdough starter that's older than I am. The man who owned it before you called him Cain. Treat him well." He didn't offer to help with her satchel. He simply expected her to climb up onto the wagon seat, which she did. her movements stiff but determined. The world looked different from this new height. She was no longer a solitary figure walking through the dust. She was part of this strange, rolling enterprise. Luke swung into his own saddle, and with a call to the other men, a half-dozen riders who had been waiting. Mounted and ready, the entire outfit began to move. They left Dust Creek without a backward glance, the rhythmic clanging of the blacksmith's hammer fading behind them until it was swallowed by the immense silence of the open range. The days that followed blurred into a relentless routine of labor. Clara learned that a trail cook's work was a battle fought against dust, heat, and time. She was up hours before the sun, the lone figure awake in a sleeping camp. Her first task was always the fire, coaxing a flame from the embers of the night before, its light a small, defiant pinprick in the vast, pre-dawn darkness. Then came the coffee, boiled strong and black in a huge, smoke-stained pot. The sound of her grinding the beans was the true reveille for the camp. The men would emerge from their bedrolls, shadows taking human form, drawn to the fire and the smell of the coffee. They were a rough, anonymous group in the dim light. They moved with a shared weariness, their face grimy with trail dust, their talk a low murmur of monosyllables, as the outline of her promise had suggested. None of them asked her where she was from. They never asked her name. They approached her fire, held out their tin cups, and asked the only question that mattered to them, coffee hot. She would nod, and they would take their cups and retreat to the edges of the firelight, their silence a wall she had no desire to breach. She served them breakfast biscuits and bacon, or beans simmered with salt pork on tin plates, which they ate quickly before saddling their horses and disappearing with the herd into the rising sun. Her day was spent driving the chuck wagon, a slow, lumbering journey over the endless, rolling sea of grass. The wagon was her sanctuary, a cramped, cluttered space that was entirely her own. She learned its rhythms, the way it swayed over uneven ground, the specific groan of each wheel. She organized the supplies, the sacks of flour and beans, the slabs of bacon hanging from hooks, creating a small bubble of order amidst the magnificent chaos of the prairie. The evenings were a repeat of the mornings, but in reverse. The men would return, exhausted and coated in a fresh layer of dust, their hunger a palpable thing. She would have a fire blazing and supper ready, usually beef, potatoes, and more beans. A monotonous but life-sustaining diet. They ate again, in relative silence, the scrape of forks on tin plates the loudest sound. After the meal, when she had cleaned the last of the pots with sand and water, the true life of the camp would begin. The men would gather around the campfire, its flames pushing back the immense, encroaching darkness. This was their time. They mended gear, smoked pipes, and spoke in low, easy tones. Their talk was of cattle, of weather, of towns they had known and trails they had ridden. It was a closed circle, a brotherhood forged by shared hardship, and she was not a part of it. Every night, Clara would take her tin cup of coffee and find a place to sit on her own, well outside their circle of light. She would lean against a wheel of the chuck wagon or find a smooth, flat rock and watch them from the shadows. The distance was a shield. In the darkness, she was invisible. She could observe without being observed, listen without being expected to speak. It was a lonely vigil, but it felt safe. She knew Luke Carver noticed. He was the trail boss, and very little escaped his steady, watchful gaze. She would sometimes see his eyes flick toward the shadows where she sat, a brief, assessing glance. But he never made a move to close the distance. He never called out to her, never invited her to join the men at the fire. He never approached her small, self-imposed island of solitude. He saw the line she had drawn in the dirt, and he did not cross it. His respect for her boundary was a silent, ongoing conversation, and it was the only one they had. Several weeks passed in this manner. The landscape changed from flat plains to rolling hills, but the rhythm of their days remained the same. Clara grew stronger, her hands chapped and calloused from the work, her skin tanned by the sun. The hollow ache in her heart had not disappeared, but it was quieter now, muffled by the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion that claimed her each night. Then came a night when the wind rose. It was a restless, insistent wind that blew in from the north, carrying the first real bite of autumn. It moaned through the tall grass and whipped at the campfire, stealing its heat and sending sparks scattering into the darkness. The circle of warmth and light around the fire shrank, and the men huddled closer together, pulling their collars up against the chill. Clara sat in her usual spot, leaning against the wagon wheel, her thin shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. It offered little protection against the relentless wind. She shivered, her teeth chattering, watching the men by the fire with a detached sense of envy for their shared warmth. The fire began to die down, the flames sinking to glowing orange coals. The men, one by one, unrolled their bedrolls and settled down for the night, creating a tight ring around the last of the heat. Soon, the only one still moving was Luke. He stood by the fire for a long moment, staring into the dying embers. Clara watched him, a shadow observing a shadow. She expected him to unroll his bedding next to the others and surrender to sleep, but he didn't. He picked up his bedroll, a thick roll of canvas and wool blankets, and turned away from the fire. He walked not toward the circle of sleeping men, but away from it, into the colder darkness that separated the main camp from her solitary post. He stopped, perhaps 20 feet from her, a vast and respectable distance. He was now positioned almost directly between her and the fire. With slow, deliberate movements, he bent down and unrolled his bed. The sound of the canvas unfurling was a soft asterisk whoomp asterisk in the wind. He arranged his blankets and then, without so much as a glance in her direction, he lay down, pulled his hat over his eyes, and settled in for the night, his back to her. Clara sat frozen, the cold forgotten. She stared at the space he had created. He hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't made a gesture, but his meaning was as clear as if he had shouted it across the wind. He had not invited her to his bedroll. He had moved his bedroll to create a new boundary, a new geography for the camp. He had created a safe, empty space for her, a patch of ground that was now sheltered from the wind by his own body and, more importantly, a space that was closer to the life-giving warmth of the fire. He was offering her heat without demanding she sacrifice her distance. Suspicion, her old and faithful companion, whispered in her ear, but she watched his still form, the steady, even rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed. And she knew this was not a trick. It was a quiet, practical kindness, as simple and direct as his job offer had been. It was an acknowledgement of her coldness, and a solution offered without comment or expectation. She waited for a long time, until she was sure he was asleep. Then, clutching her own thin blanket, she rose from her place by the wheel. She moved silently through the darkness, her feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. She didn't go far, just 10 or 15 feet, until she reached the edge of the space his action had created. She sat down, closer to the glowing coals than she had been all night. A faint wave of warmth washed over her, a small but profound comfort. She was still alone. She was still far from the circle of men, but she was no longer shivering in the dark. She wrapped her blanket around herself and stared into the embers, feeling the first, tentative thaw of a long and bitter winter within her soul. The new geography of the camp held for many nights. The space Luke Carver had cleared with the silent placement of his bedroll became hers by unspoken agreement. Each evening, after the clatter of tin plates and the scrubbing of pots was done, Clara would retreat to this small patch of ground. It was no longer at the far edge of the darkness, but in a quiet middle ground, a territory that belonged neither to the tight circle of the fire nor to the vast, lonely darkness of the prairie. She was close enough now to feel the fire's warmth on her face, to hear the low murmur of the men's conversations, but still separate enough to maintain the shield of her solitude. No one ever mentioned the change. The cowboys, men accustomed to reading the subtle language of the land and the sky, seemed to understand this new topography of respect and accepted it as a fact of their trail life. They continued to treat her with a rough, functional courtesy. Her coffee was always hot, her biscuits were always fresh, and that was the beginning and end of their concern. She was the cook, a necessary cog in the machine of the cattle drive. She asked for nothing more, and they offered nothing more. It was a fragile peace, and she knew it. The trail was a hard place, and it wore men down, stripping away the thin veneer of civility until only raw, frayed edges were left. The first sign of its fraying came after a long, grueling week of pushing the herd across a wide, muddy river. The crossing had cost them a day and a half, leaving the men exhausted, irritable, and soaked to the bone. That night, for the first time in weeks, a bottle of whiskey appeared at the campfire. It was passed from hand to hand, a reward for their hardship, and its effect was immediate. The usual weary silence of the camp was replaced by a louder, more boisterous energy, laughter, sharp and raw, cut through the night. Old stories were told with renewed vigor, their punchlines punctuated by whoops and hollers. Clara watched from her accustomed spot, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The smell of the whiskey on the air was a scent she associated with noise, with unpredictability, with the loss of control that so often preceded cruelty. One of the cowboys, a man named Harlan with a perpetually sour expression and restless eyes, seemed to be the loudest. He had taken more than his share from the bottle, and his voice grew thick and belligerent. His talk, as it often did with men of his sort when liquor loosened their tongues, turned to women. He spoke of saloon girls in dusty towns, his stories crude and boastful, painting the women as objects of conquest and scorn. Most of the other men paid him little mind, lost in their own thoughts or private conversations. But Harlan craved an audience. Clara kept her head down, her focus trained on the tin cup of coffee she held in her hands, its warmth a small, solid comfort against the rising chill of her anxiety. She tried to block out his voice, to let it become just another sound of the night, like the chirping of crickets or the lonely call of a distant coyote. But then Harlan's tone shifted, becoming laced with a particular brand of vicious self-pity. He began complaining about a woman in Abilene who had, in his telling, taken his money and then refused him. His voice dripped with a righteous indignation that curdled in the air. "Paid for a whole night," he slurred, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled near the edge of the fire. And she just sat there, looking at the wall. Never said a word. Some women, they think they can buy their way out of a bargain with silence. The words struck Clara with the physical force of a slap. Her breath hitched in her throat. The coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. Every sound in the universe seemed to cease, except for the ringing in her own ears. Asterisk, buy their way out of a bargain with silence. The phrase was a key, turning a lock on a door deep inside her that she fought every single day to keep bolted shut. It was a perfect, brutal distillation of her deepest shame, the feeling that her own quiet endurance had been a kind of currency, a payment rendered for a violation she had been powerless to stop. The fire, which had been a source of comfort just moments before, now seemed to cast a harsh, accusatory light. She felt as though every man in the camp was staring at her, that they could all see the ugly story Harlan's words had just scrawled across her face. A thick, uncomfortable silence fell over the campfire. The other men shifted, their easy camaraderie suddenly gone. A younger cowboy named Billy cleared his throat and stared intently into the flames. His face flushed. They knew Harlan had crossed a line. They might not have known why his words were so cruel, but they felt the specific poison in them. They felt her presence in the shadows, and they were ashamed. Harlan, too drunk to read the room, seemed to puff up in the silence, mistaking it for rapt attention. That's the way of it. Ain't it a man pays his coin, and... He never finished the sentence. Luke Carver had been sitting on the far side of the fire, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic asterisk, asterisk, a steady counterpoint to the crackle of the flames. He hadn't appeared to be listening, but now the sound stopped. With a slow, deliberate motion that was more menacing than any sudden movement could have been, he set the stone and the knife carefully on the ground beside him. He rose to his feet in one fluid, silent motion. He didn't stride across the circle. He just seemed to be there, standing over the seated, drunken cowboy. His face, cast in shadow and firelight, was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even clench his fists. He simply reached down, grabbed a handful of Harlan's shirt, and hauled him to his feet. Harlan stumbled, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and drunken confusion. Luke didn't hit him. He just pushed him. A single, powerful shove that sent the man staggering backward, out of the circle of firelight and into the darkness. Harlan tripped over a saddle and landed in a heap in the dust. He lay there, stunned and sputtering. Luke stood where he was, his tall frame a black silhouette against the flames. When he spoke, his voice was low, devoid of heat, but it carried the chilling finality of a judge passing sentence. "Shut your mouth," Luke said, the words cutting cleanly through the night air. He looked around the circle, his gaze touching each of the other men, pinning them in place. Nobody here needs to apologize for what they survived. The statement was absolute. It was a law. It was a shield, held up not just for her, but for anyone who carried a wound they did not speak of. He was not just defending her. He was defending the very principle of survival against shame. He turned, walked back to his spot, and picked up his knife and stone. Asterisk, shk, shk, shk. The sound began again, steady and implacable, as if nothing had happened. The spell was broken. Harlan scrambled to his feet, muttering curses under his breath, and slunk away toward his bedroll without another word. The other men, one by one, found reasons to be busy. They checked on their horses. They knocked out their pipes. They unrolled their bedding. The shared bottle of whiskey lay forgotten in the dirt. The campfire, which had been a stage for Harlan's drunken cruelty, became once more just a place of weary men seeking rest. Clara remained frozen in the shadows, her heart beating a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She had been hurt by men. She had been ignored by men. She had been treated like a functional object by men, but she had never, not once, been defended by one. The act was so foreign, so utterly outside the realm of her experience, that her mind struggled to comprehend it. He had protected her. He had protected her story without ever asking what it was. He had seen her wound without looking at it, and he had stood guard over it. She stayed there long after the last of the men had settled into their bedrolls, long after the only sound was the wind and the crackling of the fire. She watched Luke, who remained awake, staring into the flames, his shoulders a strong, solid line. Finally, when the camp was deep in the stillness of the night, she moved. She pushed herself to her feet, her limbs stiff and trembling. She took a step, and then another, walking out of the shadows and into the flickering light of the fire. It was a journey of only a few yards, but it felt like crossing a continent. Luke looked up as she approached. His expression was calm, unreadable. He did not speak. He did not smile. He simply watched her. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the fire, which was beginning to burn low. She walked to the pile of firewood stacked near the edge of the camp. She searched for a moment, her hands brushing past the smaller pieces of kindling. She chose a log, not a small one, but a thick, solid piece of oak that would burn slow and hot through the night. Carrying it in both arms, she walked back to the fire. She bent down and carefully, gently, placed the log onto the glowing red heart of the embers. A shower of bright orange sparks flew up into the darkness. The embers flared, licking at the fresh wood. A small flame caught, then another, and the fire blazed up anew. pushing back the darkness, casting the camp in a stronger, warmer light. She said nothing. She did not need to. She had made her reply. She had stepped out of the shadows. She had accepted the protection he offered, and she had added her own fuel to the fire. The law Luke Carver laid down by the fire that night held a surprising power. It settled over the camp like a new weather pattern, changing the atmosphere in subtle but profound ways. Harlan, the drunken cowboy, became a sullen ghost, performing his duties with a resentful silence and never again meeting Clara's eyes. The other men, too, seemed to have absorbed their boss's decree. A quiet, almost formal distance was established, a perimeter of respect drawn around her that was more effective than any physical barrier. They still did not speak to her of personal matters, but their requests for coffee or food were now couched in a less demanding tone. They made a point to stack their dirty plates neatly. They moved out of her way when she carried a heavy pot. They were small, almost imperceptible shifts, but to Clara, they were monumental. She had been given a place in their world, and that place was inviolable. In this new, quiet space, she began to observe, her work was still a relentless cycle of fire, flour, and iron, but in the moments between tasks, her eyes would find Luke Carver. She learned the rhythms of his day, the way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders as he scanned the horizon, the low, calm tone he used to give orders. She saw the immense weight of responsibility he carried for the herd and for the men, a burden that seemed to rest so lightly upon him. She also learned his small, personal rituals. Of these, the most consistent was the matter of his hat. Every evening, when the long day's ride was over and the herd was settled for the night, he would ride into camp, dismount, and lead his sorrel to the makeshift picket line. Before he did anything else, before he got a cup of coffee, before he washed the dust from his face, he would take off his hat and hang it on a particular knob of a weathered picket post they drove into the ground each night. It was a simple, functional object, a dark felt Stetson, its brim curled from use, its crown stained with sweat and dust and rain. It was creased and battered, a testament to a hard life lived under an open sky. But to Clara, it became a symbol. The hanging of the hat was a signal, a silent declaration that the day's work was done, that for a few hours, the trail boss could rest. It was the one moment he allowed himself to be unguarded, the one piece of his armor he set aside. She found herself watching for it each evening, this small, dependable act, and the sight of the hat on the post brought with it a quiet, unexamined sense of relief. It meant the day was over. It meant he was back safe. The trail pushed north, and the weather turned. The crisp, golden days of early autumn gave way to a persistent, dreary cold. The sky became a low, gray ceiling of bruised-looking clouds that wept a miserable, chilling drizzle from dawn until dusk. The prairie turned from a sea of grass to a sea of mud. The work became twice as hard, the cattle twice as difficult to manage. The mood in the camp grew grim, the men's tempers worn as thin as their soaked leather gloves. One evening, they made camp in a shallow, wind-swept valley that offered little protection from the elements. A cold, driving rain lashed down, turning the ground into a slick, ankle-deep mire. The wind howled, a mournful, ceaseless cry that seemed to seep into a man's bones. The fire sputtered and hissed, a pathetic thing that offered more smoke than warmth. The men, soaked through and shivering, were in a foul humor. Clara worked under the partial shelter of the chuck wagon's canvas fly, her hands numb with cold as she sliced bacon into a hot skillet. The rain dripped from the canvas and ran in rivulets across the ground, threatening to extinguish her precious fire. She felt a familiar despair creeping in, the feeling of being small and helpless against a vast, indifferent world. It was then that Luke and the last of the riders returned, their figures emerging like ghosts from the gray, rain-swept twilight. They were slumped in their saddles, the very picture of exhaustion. Luke dismounted, his movements stiff with cold. He led his horse to the picket line, his boots making sucking sounds in the deep mud, as he always did. He removed his hat, but as he reached to hang it on the post, a sudden, vicious gust of wind tore it from his grasp. The hat cartwheeled through the air for a moment and landed with a soft, wet slap in a puddle of muddy water. Luke swore under his breath, a low, weary sound of pure frustration. He was clearly too cold and tired to deal with it at that moment. He turned his back on the fallen hat and went to tend to his horse, his shoulders hunched against the driving rain. Clara watched from under the canvas fly. She saw the hat, a dark, forlorn shape, half submerged in the mud. It was his. It was that small piece of him that he set aside each night, now abandoned and soiled. A strange, protective instinct flared within her. It was an impulse she hadn't felt in years, a desire to offer a small measure of comfort in a harsh world. She hesitated for only a heartbeat. Her own fear and ingrained habit of invisibility warred with this new, unfamiliar urge. But the sight of his weariness, the memory of his quiet defense of her, tipped the scale. She wiped her hands on her apron, pulled her shawl tighter over her head, and stepped out from the shelter of the wagon into the relentless, slanting rain. The mud was cold and slick under her boots. She walked the few yards to the picket line and bent down, her fingers sinking into the cold ooze as she retrieved the hat. It was heavier than she expected, sodden with water and caked with mud. It felt strangely personal in her hands, as if she were holding a part of the man himself. She carried it back to the relative dryness of her workspace, using a corner of a clean burlap sack. She began to gently wipe away the mud. Her movements were slow, careful. She wasn't just cleaning it, she was tending to it. She worked the cloth over the felt, her touch light, as if trying to smooth away not just the dirt, but the weariness and frustration of the day that it represented. When she had cleaned it as best she could, she looked for a place to put it. It was too wet to simply set down. Inside the chuck wagon, hanging from a rafter, was a row of iron hooks she used for utensils. The space just inside the canvas flap was the driest and warmest place in camp. Catching the residual heat from her cook fire, she reached up and hung the hat on an empty hook, where it could drip and slowly dry through the night. She had brought a symbol of him into her sanctuary, into her world. The act felt both intimate and necessary. She returned to her cooking, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know if he had seen her. She didn't know what he would think. When supper was ready, she served the men as usual. They ate huddled under whatever shelter they could find, their faces grim. Luke took his plate and ate standing up, his back to the wind, his expression unreadable. She saw his eyes glance once toward the picket post, saw the brief, almost imperceptible pause as he registered that his hat was not there. Another cowboy, young Billy, subtly tilted his head toward the chuck wagon. Luke's gaze followed, and he saw it, hanging just inside the canvas. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, without a word, without even a glance in her direction, he turned back to his meal. Nothing was said. The gesture was left to hang in the air, as quiet and unremarked upon as all their other silent exchanges. The next morning, Clara rose in the absolute darkness, as she always did. The rain had stopped, but the cold was deeper now, a sharp, penetrating chill that promised frost. She braced herself for the miserable task of coaxing a fire to life from damp wood. She pulled on her boots, wrapped her shawl around her, and pushed open the canvas flap of the wagon. And then she stopped. There, in the center of the camp, where only dead, wet ashes had been the night before, a small, perfect fire was already burning. It wasn't a large, roaring blaze, but a small, expertly built pyramid of kindling that crackled and spit, casting a warm, welcoming orange glow on the damp ground around it. And propped on a rock next to the flames, steaming in the cold air, was a single tin cup of coffee. She stood there, motionless, staring. No one else was awake. The camp was a circle of sleeping, blanket-wrapped forms, This had been done for her, in the coldest, darkest hour of the morning, while she slept. He had risen and performed the first part of her job. He had built her a fire. He had made her coffee. Slowly, she walked toward it, as if approaching a shy animal. She picked up the cup. The metal was hot, and the warmth seeped into her frozen fingers. A feeling so intensely pleasant it was almost painful. She took a sip. It was black and strong, just the way she would have made it. This was his reply. This was his thank you. It was a gesture made in her own language, the language of quiet, practical service. He had taken her act of care and returned it in kind, offering her the gift of warmth and a few precious, stolen moments of peace before the grueling day began. She drank the coffee, standing by the small, solitary fire, and watched the first pale gray light begin to stain the eastern horizon. And when the cup was empty, she set it down and began to mix the biscuit dough, her movements sure and steady in the light of the fire he had built for her. From that day on, it became their new routine, every morning, no matter the weather. She awoke to find a small fire burning and a single cup of coffee waiting. It was a silent conversation, a daily reaffirmation of the unspoken bond that was growing between them, built not on words or promises, but on a wet hat and a hot cup of coffee in the cold, lonely darkness before the dawn. The end of the trail did not announce itself with a trumpet, but with a slow, subtle change in the land. The endless rolling ocean of prairie grass began to give way to scattered homesteads, their windmills spinning like lonely silver flowers against the vast sky. The air, which for weeks had smelled only of earth, cattle, and campfire smoke, now carried the faint, foreign sense of wood smoke from a chimney, of baking bread, of civilization. For the men, this change was a release. A boisterous, restless energy rippled through the camp. Their talk turned from cattle and weather to the promise of hot baths, soft beds, and the burn of cheap whiskey. They were headed back to Dust Creek to deliver the herd to a railhead buyer and collect their pay. Their long, arduous journey was over, and a celebration was due. For Clara, the feeling was entirely different. The chuck wagon, once a cramped and functional workspace, had become a sanctuary, its canvas walls a fortress against a world that had offered her little comfort. The relentless routine of her work, which had once seemed a form of punishment, had become a source of purpose and a shield against memory. The trail, for all its hardship, had been a place of quiet, unspoken acceptance. Now, it was ending. The return to town felt not like a homecoming, but like a fall from grace, a return to a world of judging eyes and whispered questions. The uncertainty she had felt on her first night in Dust Creek returned with a vengeance. Her silent morning ritual with Luke had continued, an unbroken chain of small, profound kindnesses. Every dawn, she awoke to a fire and a cup of coffee, a gift of warmth that prepared her for the day. And every evening, if his hat was wet or dusty, she would tend to it, a quiet act of care that was her only reply. They had built an entire language without ever speaking a single personal word, a language of gestures and services that was more honest than any conversation she had ever known. She feared that this language would not translate to the noise and scrutiny of a town. Their arrival in Dust Creek was a chaotic affair. The thunder of thousands of hooves, the shouts of the cowboys, the thick cloud of dust that enveloped the main street, it was a sensory assault after the deep quiet of the plains. People poured out of the saloon and the general store to watch the spectacle. Clara, perched on the high seat of the chuck wagon, felt 1,000 eyes upon her. She kept her gaze fixed on the mules' steady, plodding backs, her hands clenched tight in her lap, her face a mask of neutrality. The men delivered the herd, and soon the town was flush with their pay. The saloon erupted in a roar of celebration that would last for days. The cowboys, released from their discipline, became loud, boisterous strangers. Clara collected her wages from Luke, a small, heavy pouch of coins he placed in her hand without ceremony. "You earned it," was all he said, his eyes already scanning the chaotic street, his mind on the business of paying off the men and settling accounts. She took her satchel and her pay and walked through the boisterous town to the one place that felt safe. The bell above the door of Willow House chimed, and Agnes Wilkes looked up from the front counter, her expression as calm and unchanging as ever. She simply nodded, as if Clara had only been gone for an hour. "The room at the top of the stairs is empty," Agnes said. It was all the welcome Clara needed. But if Willow House was the same, the town was not. The story of the cattle drive had arrived before she had. The Cowboys, their tongues loosened by whiskey in the saloon, had talked. They were rough men, not poets, and their stories were blunt and unadorned. They spoke of the relentless hard work, the river crossing, the stampede that had almost happened, and, inevitably, they spoke of the cook. The tale that took root in the fertile soil of the town's gossip was a fragmented but compelling one. They said she was silent, never speaking a word that wasn't necessary. They said she was tireless, working from before the sun was up to long after it had set. And, most intriguingly, they told the story of Harlan. The details varied with each telling, but the core of it remained a drunken insult had been uttered. And Luke Carver, a man not known for his temper, had physically thrown the offender from the firelight and laid down a law of silence about a person's past. From these raw materials, the town of Dust Creek constructed a legend. She became the Silent Woman, a figure of mystery. Her silence was not seen as weakness or fear, as it had been on her first arrival, but as a sign of some deep, hidden strength. Her competence as a cook was proof of her substance, and Luke Carver's fierce, quiet protection of her was proof of her worth. She was, as the whispers in the general store and the sewing circle concluded, silent, but not cowardly. Clara felt the shift in the way people looked at her. The stares were no longer cold and dismissive. They were curious, speculative, even a little fearful. The townswomen would watch her as she walked to the store, their heads tilted together, their conversations dropping to a murmur as she passed. She was no longer invisible. She was a story, a puzzle they were desperate to solve. The attention was a different kind of violation, a prying that sought to own her history, to define her by a past they could only imagine. The epicenter of this curiosity was the general store, a place that traded in gossip as much as it did in flour and calico. And the high priestess of this trade was Martha Gable, the store owner's wife, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose sharp tongue embellished everything. It was there, 2 days after their return, that she finally cornered Luke Carver. Clara was in her room at Willow House, mending a tear in her dress. When it happened, Luke had gone to the store to purchase supplies for his own small ranch, a piece of land he worked when he wasn't running cattle for others. He was standing at the counter, negotiating the price of coffee beans, when Martha Gable and 2 of her companions descended upon him. "Mr. Carver," she began, her voice sweet as molasses but with an edge of steel. "The whole town is just so impressed with the way you brought that herd in. Such a long, hard drive." Luke gave a short, non-committal nod, his attention still on the storekeeper. "It was a job of work, ma'am." "And you had that new cook with you," she pressed on, ignoring his attempt to deflect. "The quiet one. Stays with Agnes Wilkes. It seems she worked out quite well." "She's a good cook," Luke said, his voice flat. He turned his attention back to his supplies. "That'll be all. Henry." But Martha Gable was not so easily deterred. She moved to block his path to the door, her friends flanking her like a pair of hungry hens. "It's just that, well, people are curious. A woman like that, traveling alone, it's unusual. She seems to have no people, no connections." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "A person can't help but wonder what her story is, what kind of past she has." The question hung in the dusty, spice-scented air of the store. It was the question the whole town wanted answered. It was a demand for the key to the puzzle, for the last chapter of the story they had written for her. Luke stood perfectly still. He did not look at Mrs. Gable. Instead, his gaze seemed to drift past her, out the grimy window to the street beyond. He seemed to be considering the weight of the flour sack in his hand, the quality of the light, anything but the woman in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry or defensive. It was quiet, calm, and utterly final. It was a door being shut, quietly but firmly, in her face. "Ma'am," he said, his steady gray eyes finally meeting hers. "I don't know a thing about her past." He paused, letting the silence stretch, before delivering the final, decisive blow. "I know she cooked a good meal today." He tipped his hat, a gesture of politeness that was somehow more insulting than any curse would have been. "Ladies!" And with that, he stepped around them as if they were nothing more than sacks of grain, paid for his goods, and walked out into the sunlight, leaving the three women standing in a pool of stunned, rebuffed silence. The story of that exchange traveled through Dust Creek even faster than the story of Harlan had. It became the final, definitive chapter of the legend. Luke Carver had drawn a line, not in the dirt of a campfire, but on the floor of the most public space in town. He had declared, in his own quiet way, that a person's past was their own private property. He had judged Clara not on where she had been, but on what she could do, on the simple, tangible fact of her competence. Clara heard the story that evening from Agnes, who reported it without comment, as if she were merely recounting the price of eggs. But the words resonated deep within Clara. She sat in her small room, the mending lying forgotten in her lap, and stared out the window at the town settling into dusk. The whispers would not stop entirely. She knew that. But they had been answered. A wall had been built around her, not of stone or timber, but of a man's quiet, unyielding respect. For the second time, he had stood between her and the world, and for the second time, he had done it without asking for a single thing in return. The days after the cattle drive settled into a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm. Dust Creek returned to its sleepy, wind-scoured self, the brief, raucous infusion of the Cowboy's pay already a receding memory. Clara found a measure of peace within the sturdy, beeswax-scented walls of Willow House. She helped Agnes Wilkes with the daily chores, scrubbing floors, peeling vegetables, hanging laundry in the yard where it snapped and danced in the relentless wind. The work was simple, honest, and it kept her hands busy, which in turn helped to quiet her mind. She earned her keep, and Agnes asked for nothing more. But the small pouch of coins from the drive was a constant, heavy presence. It was a finite resource, a clock ticking down toward another crossroads, another moment of uncertainty. She was safe for now, but she was not settled. She was a ship in a quiet harbor, but she had no anchor. Luke Carver existed in a separate but parallel world. He had a small ranch a few miles out of town, a place he was trying to build from scratch. He would ride into Dust Creek once or twice a week for supplies, his posture in the saddle as straight and steady as it had been on the trail. Their paths would cross occasionally. She might be shaking a rug from an upstairs window as he rode past, or he might be loading sacks of grain onto his horse as she walked back from the well. Their encounters were always brief, marked by a quiet, almost formal acknowledgement, a slow nod from him, a slight, almost imperceptible inclination of her head in return. They were like two planets held in a delicate, invisible orbit, acknowledging each other's presence across a vast expanse of silence. The silent language of the trail of tended hats and morning coffee had no vocabulary for this new, town-bound life. And so, they did not speak. But she felt his presence as a kind of bulwark. His quiet, definitive statement in the general store had spread through the town and solidified into an accepted truth. The whispers had not vanished, but they had lost their venom. The curiosity was still there, but it was now tinged with a measure of respect, even awe. He had defined her for the town not by her past, but by her present. And in doing so, had given her the one thing she craved, the right to be left alone. She knew she owed him a debt for that, a debt that could not be repaid with money or with words. One late afternoon, the sky was the color of a faded pewter bowl, and the wind had a sharp, biting edge that promised the first hard frost of winter. Clara was on the back porch of Willow House, helping Agnes take down a line of dry laundry. The sheets were stiff with cold, and her hands were chapped and red from the wind and the lye soap. She worked methodically, folding the crisp linen into neat squares, her movements economical and precise. She heard the sound of a horse and looked up to see Luke dismounting at the hitching post in the alley behind the inn. He had come to deliver a quarter of venison to Agnes, a common form of trade in a town where hard currency was often scarce. He and Agnes spoke for a few moments in low tones, their breath pluming in the cold air. Clara kept her back to them, focusing on her work, her movements becoming a little stiffer, a little more self-conscious. She felt him approach before she heard him. It was a change in the air, a solid presence at her back. She stopped folding and stood very still, her hands resting on the stack of clean linen. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had ever used her name. She had told it to him once, on the first day, when he was finalizing his roster for the paymaster. He had simply written it down in a small ledger and never spoken it aloud. Hearing it now, in his low, calm voice, was both startling and strangely settling. She turned slowly to face him. He stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, just as he had on the morning they first met. His gray eyes were steady, and his face was somber in the fading light. He was not looking at her face, but at her hands, which were raw and red against the white of the sheets. He held something out to her. It was a single leather glove. Not a pair, just one. It was made for the left hand, and it was old. The deerskin worn to a soft, supple texture, the color of rich, dark honey. The stitching along the seams was tight and even, the work of a careful hand. It was a woman's glove, sized for a slender hand, but it was a work glove, built for purpose, not for show. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice quiet, matter of fact. He kept his hand outstretched, waiting. She was a small woman, but her hands were never idle. She wore this one when she tended her garden, or when she worked with the lye soap. She always said the right hand needed to be free to feel the world, but the left hand needed a shield. Clara stared at the glove, at the story it told in its creases and scuffs. It was a piece of his history, a piece of his heart, and he was offering it to her. She didn't know what to do. To accept it felt too intimate. To refuse it felt like an act of cruelty. He seemed to understand her hesitation. "She made me promise," he went on, his gaze still fixed on the glove, as if he were reading words written on the worn leather. "Before she passed, she told me to give it to someone with hands that knew how to keep things warm, not how to keep a person." The words settled into the quiet air, profoundly simple and deeply complex. Asterisk hands that knew how to keep things warm. He was talking about her, about the fire she built, the coffee she brewed, the meals she cooked. He had seen the purpose in her hands, the quiet service, and he was honoring it. And the second part, asterisk, not how to keep a person, asterisk, was a recognition of her fiercely guarded independence. A promise that this gift was not a claim, not a chain, but a simple offering, freely given, slowly, as if in a dream. She lifted her left hand and reached for it. Her rough, red fingers brushed against his as she took the glove. His hand was calloused and warm. The leather of the glove was cool, but it seemed to hold a residual warmth, a memory of the woman who had worn it for so many years. She slid her hand into it. It fit perfectly, a second skin of soft, protective leather. She looked down at her gloved hand, then up at him. The wall of silence she had so carefully constructed around her heart began to crumble. For months, a question had been burning inside her, a question she had been too afraid to ask, a question she felt she had no right to. But in the quiet intimacy of this moment, in the face of this extraordinary, gentle kindness, the fear receded. Her voice, when it came, was a near whisper, fragile and hoarse with disuse. "Why?" she asked, her throat tight. "Why did you never ask me?" He did not pretend to misunderstand. He knew what she meant. He knew she was not talking about the glove. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers for a long, steady moment. He was seeing her now, all of her, and there was no judgment in his gaze, only a deep, quiet knowing. "About that night," she clarified, forcing the words out, needing to give voice to the ugly thing that had haunted them both in silence. About what Harlan said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then his eyes shifted, looking past her to the darkening line of the horizon. He seemed to be choosing his words with the same care a man might choose his footing on a treacherous path. He was not going to answer her question directly. He was not going to speak the other man's name, not going to give that poison any more power. Instead, he was going to answer the larger question, the one that lay beneath it all, asterisk. "Why have you been kind to me, asterisk?" And he answered it by going back not to the night of the insult, but to the night of the wind, to his first true act of care. "Because my only business on that trail was my own bedroll," he said, his voice low and even. "I just unrolled it where I thought it would do some good." He looked back at her then, his expression serious, his meaning clear. He was not just talking about blankets. "Whether you took the warmth," he finished softly, "or whether you chose to sleep in the cold, that was always going to be your choice, not mine." The words were a revelation. He was telling her that he had never seen her as a victim to be saved, a broken thing to be fixed. He had seen her as a person with her own will, her own power to choose. He had not offered her salvation. He had simply offered her a possibility, a space, a chance for warmth, and had trusted her to make her own decision. He had not sought to rescue her from her past. He had only sought to give her a safe place in the present. He understood, in a way no one else ever had, that she did not want to be saved. She only wanted the right to save herself. A profound, shuddering relief washed through her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It was the feeling of a heavy, invisible burden being lifted from her shoulders. All this time, she had thought he was protecting her, but he had been doing something far more important. He had been respecting her. He gave a small, final nod, as if his business was now concluded. He turned without another word and walked away, his boot heels making a steady, rhythmic sound on the hard-packed earth. He mounted his horse and rode off into the gathering twilight, leaving her alone on the porch, the air cold on her face, her left hand cradled in the impossible warmth of his mother's glove. The glove, and the words that came with it, settled something deep inside of Clara. It was like a key turning in a long rusted lock. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for years did not vanish, but it receded, its sharp edges softening. Luke's explanation of his actions that he had only ever offered her a choice, not a rescue, had fundamentally reordered her understanding of him and of herself. She had spent so long seeing herself as a victim of circumstance, a person to whom things asterisk happened asterisk. He had shown her that even in the most desperate of times, she had possessed the power to choose. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. She kept the glove tucked safely in her satchel, a secret talisman. Sometimes, in the quiet of her room at Willow House, she would take it out, the soft, worn deerskin a tangible link to his quiet strength and his mother's memory. It was a promise that kindness without condition did exist in the world. Autumn deepened, painting the cottonwoods along the creek a brilliant, aching gold. The wind grew sharper, carrying the scent of snow from the distant mountains. Clara's pouch of coins grew lighter. The future, which she had successfully kept at bay, began to press in on her again. She knew she could not stay with Agnes forever. It was on a crisp, clear afternoon that Luke Carver sought her out again. He found her in the yard behind the inn, splitting kindling for the kitchen stove. He didn't ride up with a grand announcement, but simply appeared at the edge of the yard, leading his horse, his presence as quiet and unassuming as always. He needed to move his small herd of cattle, the beginnings of his own ranch, from their summer pasture up to a more sheltered valley before the first heavy snows came. It was a short drive, only 3 or 4 days, but more than one man could handle alone. He had a young hand, Billy, the same quiet boy from the long trail drive, but he needed a cook. He needed someone to drive the wagon. "The pay is fair," he said, standing a respectful distance from the chopping block, his gaze on the axe in her hands rather than on her face. "The work is cold, but you know the work." He was not offering charity. He was offering a job. Based on the competence he had already witnessed, he was offering her a way to earn her own future. And he was, in his own quiet way, telling her that he trusted her. "I know the work," she agreed, her voice steady. And so, she found herself back on the high seat of a chuck wagon, the familiar, gentle sway of it, a welcome rhythm. This journey was different from the first. The massive, chaotic herd was gone, replaced by 100 head of sturdy, calm cattle. The large, boisterous crew of cowboys was gone, replaced by the quiet, efficient presence of young Billy. And the silence between her and Luke was different, too. Before, it had been a silence of caution and uncertainty. Now, it was a silence of understanding, a comfortable space that no longer needed to be filled with words. The rituals returned as if they had never left. His hat hung on a picket post each evening, her quiet tending of it, his fire, and his single cup of coffee, waiting for her in the pre-dawn darkness. They were the verses of a song only they knew. On the 3rd night, they made camp in a high meadow, nestled in a bowl of dark, pine-covered hills. As the sun went down, a thick, white fog rolled in, swallowing the landscape. It crept down from the hills and up from the creek beds, silent and inexorable, until their small camp was an isolated island in a soft, gray sea. The fog muffled all sound, muting the crackle of the fire, the lowing of the cattle, the whisper of the wind in the pines. The world shrank until it was composed only of the circle of firelight, the 3 of them, and the deep, profound quiet. They ate their supper of beans and venison, the fog swirling around them, making ghosts of their breath in the cold air. Billy, exhausted from a long day in the saddle, finished his meal, mumbled a good night, and rolled himself into his blankets near the wagon, falling asleep almost instantly. And then it was just the 2 of them. Clara sat on an old log, nursing a cup of coffee, her back to the warmth of the fire. Luke sat on the other side, on his saddle, leaning forward with his forearms resting on his knees. He stared into the flames, his face a landscape of light and shadow, his expression thoughtful. The silence between them was complete, but it was not empty. It was filled with everything that had passed between them, the unspoken defense, the gift of the glove, the years of her pain and the months of his patience. She looked at him, truly looked at him, there in the small, intimate world the fog had created for them. She saw not just the trail boss, not just her employer, but a man who had offered her a respect so profound it had fundamentally changed her. He had built a wall around her, not to keep her in, but to keep the harshness of the world out, to give her a space where she could finally begin to heal. A thought, one that had been slowly taking shape in the back of her mind for weeks, now rose to the surface, clear and undeniable. All her life, she had been running, building walls, keeping her distance as a means of survival. Her solitude was a fortress she had built brick by brick, a cold and lonely place that had kept her safe but had also kept her imprisoned. Luke Carver had never once tried to breach those walls. He had simply stood outside them, a quiet, steady presence, and shown her that there was safety to be found not just in solitude, but in trust. He had unrolled his blankets in the cold and let her choose. He had given her his mother's glove and let her choose. He had offered her this job and let her choose. Tonight, she would choose. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. This was not a decision born of loneliness or need, or of any debt she felt she owed him. It was a decision born of a strength she was only just beginning to realize she possessed. It was her turn to make a gesture. It was her turn to unroll her blankets. She waited until the fire had burned down to a deep, pulsing bed of red and orange coals. She waited until the only sound was the hiss of the damp air on the hot embers and the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing. He had not moved. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he was not asleep. He was waiting. Slowly, she stood up. The movement felt momentous, each unfolding of her limbs a deliberate act of will. She walked to the chuck wagon, her boots making no sound on the damp, fog-shrouded earth. She gathered her worn, simple bedroll, a pair of wool blankets, and a square of canvas, and held it to her chest. It felt both flimsy and impossibly heavy. She turned and walked back toward the fire. She did not stop at her accustomed, solitary place. She kept walking, step by silent step, until she was standing in the very heart of the camp, in the warm, flickering glow of the dying fire. Luke had not moved, but she felt his eyes on her. She stopped beside his sleeping form. He lay on his side, his back to her, a still and quiet shape. She looked down at the empty space beside him, a patch of ground warmed by its proximity to the fire. It was just a space, a piece of earth, but tonight it felt like the whole world, with movements that were as quiet and deliberate as a prayer. She bent down and unrolled her blankets. The sound of the canvas was a soft sigh in the profound stillness. She laid them out parallel to his, a foot of empty space between them, a line of companionship, not of merging. She said nothing, he said nothing. He did not turn, he did not stir, but she knew he was awake. She knew he had seen. She knew he understood. His stillness was his answer. It was his consent. She slipped out of her boots, an act of vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself in the company of a man in years. She lay down on her blankets and pulled the wool up to her chin. The air was cold, but the ground was warm from the fire, and from the space beside her, she could feel the faint, radiating warmth of another human body. She lay on her back, staring up into the foggy, starless sky. She listened. She heard the soft crackle of the coals. She heard the distant, muffled sound of the sleeping cattle. And she heard the slow, steady sound of his breathing, a rhythm that was as calm and dependable as the rising of the sun. For years, sleep had been a battlefield. Every night was a new siege, a struggle against memories that ambushed her in the darkness. She slept like a soldier, lightly, one ear open for the sound of a footstep, a creaking floorboard, a threat that never came but was always expected. She would wake a dozen times a night, her heart pounding, her body slick with a cold sweat. But tonight, lying in the open, under a sky she could not see, next to a man who did not touch her, she felt a sense of safety so deep it was almost shocking. The sound of his breathing was not a threat. It was a lullaby. It was the sound of a steady, quiet strength standing guard, not over her, but with her. She was not alone in the darkness. Her own breathing began to deepen, to match the slow, even rhythm of his. The tight, painful knot of vigilance she had carried in her chest for years began to loosen. Her eyelids grew heavy. The sounds of the night faded, not into a threatening silence, but into a deep and profound peace. For the first time since she could remember, Clara slept through the night, and she did not wake up, not even once. She awoke to a world made of silver and gray. The thick fog of the night before had not entirely vanished, but had thinned to a delicate, luminous mist that clung to the pines and softened the hard edges of the world. The air was still, cold, and carried the clean, sharp scent of damp earth and wood smoke. For a long moment, she didn't move. She simply lay on her back, staring up at the pale, featureless sky, cataloging the unfamiliar sensation in her own body. It was peace, a deep, bone-weary, and utterly profound peace. The knot of fear that had lived for years in the hollow of her stomach was gone, replaced by a quiet, warm stillness. It was the first time she had greeted a morning without her first thought being one of survival. She turned her head. Luke was still asleep, a still form wrapped in his blankets, his hat resting on the ground beside him. His face, in the soft morning light, was unguarded. The serious lines around his eyes and mouth smoothed away by sleep. He looked younger. He looked peaceful. The steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing had been the anchor of her night, a constant, reassuring presence in the darkness. Quietly, so as not to wake him, she slipped from her bedroll. The cold ground was a shock to her bare feet, but she welcomed it, a sharp reminder that this moment, this feeling, was real. She pulled on her boots and walked to the fire pit. The log she had added the night before had burned down to a deep, glowing heart of embers, a perfect foundation. She added small pieces of kindling, blowing gently until a small, determined flame flickered to life. As she worked, she was aware of him stirring behind her. She did not turn. When the coffee was on, she felt him rise. He moved with a quiet economy, pulling on his boots, rolling his blankets with practiced efficiency. He came to the fire and stood beside her, holding his hands out to the new warmth. The silence between them was not the cautious, empty silence of strangers, nor the charged, anticipatory silence of lovers. It was a new thing, a silence that was full and comfortable, like a shared room where both occupants are content to simply be. He didn't thank her for the fire, and she didn't thank him for the safety of his presence. They were beyond that now. Their kindnesses were no longer transactions, but simply a part of the air they breathed. They drank their coffee as the sun began its slow ascent, burning through the last of the mist and setting the dewy meadow ablaze with a pale, golden light. Young Billy emerged from his own bedroll, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and the day began in earnest. The work of breaking camp and starting the last leg of their short journey filled the morning with practical purpose. They pushed the cattle down from the high meadow into the sheltered Box Canyon Valley that would be their winter home. The work was hard and satisfying, a final, shared effort. By midday, the herd was settled, grazing peacefully in the thick, cured grass of the valley floor, protected on three sides by high, pine-studded rock walls. Their job was done. They made their last camp near the mouth of the valley. It was a place of stark, breathtaking beauty. A cold, clear creek chuckled over smooth stones, and the aspens that lined its banks shivered in the wind, their leaves a shower of gold coins against the deep blue of the sky. This was where they would part. In the morning, Billy would ride back to the main ranch, and she and Luke would return to Dust Creek. The thought of going back, of leaving this quiet, elemental world behind, brought a sharp, familiar pang of anxiety. They ate their last meal in the fading light of the afternoon. The wind began to pick up, a restless, high-country wind that carried the scent of snow and distance. It whipped at her hair and pressed her thin dress against her, a constant reminder of the world's harshness, a reminder of the cold she had known for so long. After they had eaten, Luke went to check on the horses, and Billy began to pack some of the gear. Preparing for his early departure, Clara found herself alone by the fire, the wind a lonely voice in the pines. She looked down at her hands. The left was protected by his mother's glove, the leather now shaped perfectly to her own fingers. The right was bare, chapped and red from the work and the cold. She thought of all the hands that had touched her in her life, hands that took, hands that paid, hands that hurt. None had ever simply given. Luke returned and came to stand by the fire, his back to the wind, his gaze on the distant, snow-dusted peaks. He seemed to sense the shift in her, the gathering of a thought. He waited, his stillness an invitation. This was the moment, the end of the trail. It was now or never. The fear was still there, a faint, trembling ghost, but it was no longer her master. The strength he had shown her, the strength she was discovering in herself, was greater. She stood up and walked to him. He turned his head slightly, his gray eyes watching her, his expression calm. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the warmth of his body against the chill of the wind. She did not look at his face. Her gaze was fixed on his hand, the one that rested on his hip. It was a strong, capable hand, calloused from work, scarred from life. It was a hand that had hauled a drunken man out of the firelight. It was a hand that had gently placed a cup of coffee by a fire for her each morning. It was a hand that had never, not once, reached for her in a way that asked for anything. Slowly, she lifted her own right hand. It trembled slightly. She reached out and laid her palm against the back of his. She did not curl her fingers around his. She did not grip him. It was the lightest of touches, a simple, profound statement of contact. He did not pull away. He did not move at all. He simply allowed her touch. His stillness, a form of acceptance so complete it almost took her breath away. She took a shaky breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She had to say it. She had to give voice to the great, unspoken truth of her life, to lay it down at his feet as an offering, as the final, absolute gift of her trust. "I have never been touched," she said, her voice low and rough, but clear and steady in the whistling wind. "Without it being a debt." The words were out, a lifetime of pain and shame, distilled into a single, terrible sentence. She had placed the heaviest stone of her past into his hand. She felt a wave of dizziness, of pure terror at her own vulnerability. She half expected him to recoil, to pull away, to finally see the ugly, broken thing she had always believed herself to be. Luke did not pull away. He turned to face her fully. He looked down at her hand resting on his, and then he raised his eyes to meet hers. He truly saw her. He saw the terror and the strength warring in her eyes. He saw the woman who had survived, the woman who had placed a log on a dying fire, the woman who had tended his hat, the woman who had unrolled her blankets beside his. He did not speak. There were no words for this moment. No empty platitudes or clumsy reassurances could suffice. Words were cheap. Words could lie. His reply, like all his other replies, was an action. The wind gusted, a powerful, cold blast that tore at her thin shawl and made her shiver violently. His gaze softened with a look of profound, gentle concern. He reached not for her, but for the worn flannel shirt tied to his saddlebag. He untied it with one hand, his other still a warm, steady anchor beneath hers. He shook it out. It was old, softened by 100 washings. The colors faded to a gentle blue and gray. It was his. With a slow, deliberate movement, he draped the shirt over her shoulders. He pulled the collar up around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin for a fleeting, electric moment. He arranged the heavy fabric so that it covered her completely, a shield against the wind. It smelled of him of leather and wood smoke, and the clean, honest scent of the open air. He did not pull her close. He did not kiss her. He did not say, "I love you." He simply covered her with his shirt. It was a gesture that said, "I hear you. I see your pain, and I will do what I can to keep you warm." It was not a promise of forever. It was a promise for right now. And for Clara, right now was all that mattered. She looked up at him, and, for the first time, she smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. He did not smile back, but the serious lines of his face softened, and a deep, quiet light came into his eyes. The story does not end with a wedding dress or a picket fence. It doesn't end with a passionate kiss in the sunset. It ends here, in the cold, clear light of an autumn afternoon, by a lonely campfire in the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving West. It ends with a woman, wrapped in a man's shirt, sitting beside a man who never asked about the things she wasn't ready to tell, but who was strong enough to listen when she finally chose to speak. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, you can also support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.